We're finishing up our series of the 5 trauma responses and how they can be leveraged against people interpersonally or systemically. Now, we have to remember that all of these trauma responses don't exist solely as like one person is this type. We have different context for how this plays out. Sometimes it's about social control. So if your boss yells at you and you need that job to survive, you may fawn. But if you have all of this churning anger inside of you and you go to Target and you go to the little Starbucks at the Target and you end up getting a latte and then screaming at the barista, that is you going to anger, you flipping to anger where you felt like you had the power to do so. That is a trauma response. It doesn't excuse the behavior, right? Just because we understand where something comes from does not mean it excuses bad behavior. But this is how we can see different patterns begin to emerge. People shifting when they know they can't do something, they are in a trauma response, but then that churning either becomes internalized or externalized in response to what's going on. Now, flop is one of the ones that hits a kind of extreme note of just a total collapse. In the autistic community, we may recognize this as shutdown, right? So we have meltdowns that are kind of like an outward expression and kind of overwhelm and maybe a panic attack like experience. But shutdown is kind of a flop, right? You just stop. Nothing is going, nothing is happening, nothing is going to work. And unlike the freeze response where you're very like hyper vigilant and kind of there and you are there and you're aware, or you are dissociated and aware, right? You are not with flop. You collapse into non-functionality. And this makes you vulnerable in many ways. And this is a survival response because that sort of collapsing into a non-self can make a predator look past you or can make you seem helpless in a way that engenders some kind of caregiving or nurturing baseline in certain abusive contexts, right? And so that baseline could cause a positive response or a safety response in an abusive context. But it also makes you exceedingly vulnerable when you have this as a default response. So if you collapse in on yourself, you become dependent on the people around you, and that can be taken advantage of interpersonally. On a systemic scale, the same thing. If you go into inaction and non-functionality, this is less useful in terms of social control, but it does stop you from acting. It does make you dependent. It does make you essentially somebody who is not stopping any of the things that are happening to you because you have kind of collapsed in your sense of self. And that is just a trauma response. Again, we don't necessarily get to control what our neurology and our baselines cause in us because of trauma, but it is something to be aware of to understand how these will all interplay in different contexts and in the same person in different situations. We sometimes are going to be going through all of them or shifting between them or among them, or sometimes even having a blend of them. But it is something to understand as a framework for how these trauma responses can be generated intentionally in people in order to get them to either act in certain irrational ways or not act at all in rational ways that would prevent bad things from happening.